Throughout history, there have been many sadistic and brutal execution methods which were used to take the life of a condemned person. In England, one of the most barbaric was hanging, drawing and quartering. But across Europe, there was one terrifying method known as the breaking wheel, which was used. Often the most serious offenders would find themselves strapped to the wheel, where they would be battered and would have many of their bones shattered before they would be given a fatal blow to the neck or head which would kill. The point of the breaking wheel was to inflict as much pain and suffering as possible, but someone's body would be left on this to be eaten and picked at by birds and animals, and it was a horrific but very popular execution method. For example, in France, when the guillotine was introduced, people did not like the efficiency and the quick method of death, as they preferred seeing brutal executions such as using the breaking wheel. But there was one French highwayman who was executed on the device, and for this his execution horrified those who watched. Join us today to look at this execution, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Louis Mandrin was born on the 11th of February 1725, and he has been referred to throughout history as a Robin Hood of France. His family were rather well off, as ancestors had been very wealthy, but Louis's parents were not the most well off. His father was a horse merchant, and he died when Louis was 17, and he left behind 9 children, and Louis was the oldest, and he was now classed as the head of the family, and it was his job to go and make money for the family. But at this time in France, the people of the land hated the private tax collection agency, which was used by the French royal government. The tax collectors were known as the fermiers, or tax farmers, and they would collect all forms of tax for the king. They did not specify the amount of money to be paid, but they needed to collect a specific amount of money for the king. A lot of these men were very greedy, and they would steal a lot of wealth from the poor, and these men were seen as very unpopular, and they were very hated. Louis Mandrin first encountered these tax collectors in 1748. He had been under contract to give the French army in Italy 100 mules minus 3, as his father was a horse merchant. However, when the animals crossed the Alps, which was very dangerous, the majority of the animals tragically died en route to their destination. Because of this, Louis only had 17 mules to give to the tax collector when they arrived, and because they were in such a bad way, the fermiers refused to pay Louis Mandrin. But he would have many more run-ins with these people, and also run-ins with the law. In July 1753, Mandrin and a friend were involved in a fight, and those who they fought were killed. For this his friend was sentenced to death, and Mandrin was sent to the galleys or ships, but he managed to flee and escape. On the same day his brother was executed for being a counterfeiter, but Louis Mandrin then took this personally, and he wanted to declare war on the fermiers, and would vow to attack the tax collectors. He was part of a smuggling gang, who worked in different states peddling tobacco, and Mandrin became the head of this group. He had at his disposal an army of 300 men who were formed into a criminal military regiment, and the group even had large weapons depots, which they had stolen many different weapons, and they stored them here. Louis Mandrin believed he was at times untouchable, and he would get involved in many military campaigns, but his men would only target those unpopular tax collectors and hated parts of the French society. But in the eyes of the people, the criminal gang became very popular, and they hit the tax collectors, which gave them support from the people. Mandrin and his group would buy goods in Switzerland and then sell these in French towns and villages without paying any tax on them to the royal family, and the people of these settlements were very happy with the cheap goods they were getting. But the French government then discovered what was happening, and they then passed laws banning people from buying smuggled in goods at cheap prices. But Mandrin would go further, and he would force employees of government offices to buy his goods at gunpoint. Because of this, the local government was shocked by the violent nature of Mandrin and his army. They then asked the royalist army to help them. Mandrin was now being hunted by trained soldiers, and he tried to hide out in Savoy, but then tax collectors came into the area disguised as peasants. But Louis Mandrin was betrayed by some of his men, and he was then seized by the tax collectors the very men he was trying to attack. The King of Savoy heard of this illegal intrusion by the Fermiers into his lands, and he demanded that Louis XV handed over Louis Mandrin to his possession, and it's believed he would have then freed him in the face of the French king. But the tax collectors would not do any of this, as they wanted to have Mandrin killed immediately, and they pushed through a quick trial to get him condemned. Louis Mandrin was tried on the 24th of May 1755, and he was then sentenced to death on the breaking wheel, which was reserved for serious offenders. 2 days after his death sentence was passed and given, he was brought into Valais to an execution scaffold in front of a crowd of around 6,000 people who were there to witness the execution and the final moments of the life of the French Robin Hood. The breaking wheel, as mentioned, was a brutal and horrific execution device, and the aim of this was to inflict a significant amount of pain and suffering. The goal of it was to mutilate the body, and the executioner would usually begin with breaking the leg bones. The executioner would either do this by dropping the heavy wheel onto the shins of the condemned, or he would just batter their legs with a heavy weapon as they were strapped to the wheel. He then continued to beat them until he got to the arms, and then someone would have all of their limbs shattered and broken. The second part of the torture ordeal sometimes involved the wheel then being hoisted into the air on a mast or a pole, almost like a crucifixion, so everyone nearby could see what was happening. Following this, the executioner could then either behead or garrote the condemned, as sometimes even fires were lit under the wheel, and someone was burned on a fire, and this would ultimately end their suffering. It was a terrifying execution method for someone to witness, and the ordeal of the wheel could go on for hours and sometimes days if someone was deliberately kept alive to suffer. Louis Mandrin was strapped to the breaking wheel, and his arms, legs and stomach were battered with an iron bar, and he was then hoisted on the wheel with his arms and legs underneath him. He did not cry out or complain, but after 8 excruciating minutes, his suffering was brought to an end, and he was strangled to death by the executioner. His body was then placed on display. There were many people who were outraged with his execution, and people left sympathetic notes near to his body. Louis Mandrin was a very popular figure during his life, and he is still famous and remembered today. His actions were to target those men who were causing a significant amount of terror and distress, as they hunted money and wealth from the poor people. These men themselves became very rich and profited off the suffering of the poor. By doing this, Mandrin won the hearts of the people, but the royalists would have their brutal and barbaric way with him. He was executed in one of the most terrifying ways possible inside of France, and his execution was not quick, but it was prolonged and horrific. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.